I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate developer, I escaped poverty to provide them a life of luxury, but maintained a quiet background presence. Last Saturday, they invited me to an upscale vow renewal party to celebrate. Between champagne and caviar, my daughter-in-law leaned forward into the microphone, smirking. "You know, Richard, you are lucky we even include you, you clueless old dinosaur." I simply wiped the blood from my lip and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling their mansion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Dallas, Texas, meant brutal hard labor to outsiders. But inside our sprawling modern estate, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our $3.5 million house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet for my son Derek and his wife Monica. The reality of my massive mistake culminated on a humid Saturday evening in late September. Derek and Monica had decided they needed to host a spectacular vow renewal party to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. It was an event designed exclusively for social media bragging rights. 150 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city were mingling on the pristine lawn. There were crystal champagne towers catching the amber light of the imported string bulbs. Elaborate ice sculptures were slowly melting in the evening heat. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver platters of expensive delicacies. A live jazz band played softly on a temporary wooden stage. The entire spectacle cost exactly $150,000. And I had paid for every single cent of it out of my own pocket. I stood near the edge of the stone patio holding a simple glass of sparkling water, quietly observing the scene. I wore a tailored suit, but I have always preferred to remain in the background. I watched Monica holding court among her friends. She was 32 years old, draped in a custom silk gown that cost more than a standard luxury vehicle. She wobbled slightly on her designer heels, her face flushed with vintage champagne. Derek stood beside her, grinning, playing the role of the self-made billionaire host, completely ignoring the fact that his entire existence was subsidized by my bank accounts. Around 9 o'clock, the band stopped playing. Monica clinked her crystal glass with a silver dessert fork, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter. The guests turned their attention to the stage as she took the microphone. She announced that it was time for a comedy roast. She slurred her words slightly, stating she wanted to toast the people who made her life so wonderful, but also roast them to keep everyone incredibly humble. The crowd cheered and clapped. I offered a polite grandfatherly smile from the shadows. I fully expected some light-hearted jokes about Derek leaving his golf clubs in the hallway, or perhaps a gentle tease about my old-fashioned flip phone. She started with her college friends, tossing out mild, harmless insults that drew warm laughter from the audience. But then her glassy eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. She stumbled off the stage and walked over to where I was standing. The microphone squealed slightly, with a sharp burst of static feedback. She stopped right in front of me, flashing a wide, utterly fake smile that I had grown to deeply despise over the last 3 years. She spoke into the microphone, telling the crowd that I was a stubborn old dinosaur who refused to get with the times. People chuckled nervously. But she did not stop there. Her tone shifted rapidly. It grew sharper, colder, and laced with a venom that no amount of alcohol could excuse. She started loudly mocking my outdated clothes, my quiet demeanor, and my age, calling me a clueless old fossil who belonged in a museum. Then she looked around at her friends and said she needed to knock some modern sense into me. Without any warning, she raised her hand and slapped me squarely across the face. It was not a light, playful tap. It was a hard, violent, echoing smack that instantly silenced the nearby guests. I froze completely. I could not comprehend what had just physically happened to me. Before my brain could even process the sudden shock, she brought her hand back and struck me again and again. She kept laughing loudly into the microphone, yelling out that it was just slapstick comedy, but there was pure, unadulterated malice burning in her eyes. 4, 5, 6. The sharp, sickening cracks of her palm hitting my cheek echoed through the dead, silent garden. 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 slaps. My jaw throbbed with a burning intensity. I tasted the sharp metallic tang of blood welling up inside my mouth where my teeth had violently bitten into my inner lip. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional shock was entirely paralyzing. I did not raise my voice. I did not raise my hand to defend myself or push her away. I just stood there, breathing slowly, trying to anchor myself to reality. I looked down at my own hands hanging by my sides. They were rough, heavily scarred, and thick with calluses. 40 years ago, I was hauling 80-pound bags of cement under the brutal Texas sun, breaking my back, to lay the foundations of the commercial properties that built my wealth. My knuckles are permanently swollen from decades of hard labor. Then I slowly looked up at the hand that had just repeatedly struck my face. I looked at the massive, flawless diamond ring glittering under the patio lights on Monica's finger. It was a ring that my money had purchased. She was attacking me while draped in a lifestyle that my blood and sweat had entirely financed. The crowd was completely breathless. You could hear a pin drop on the stone patio. 150 people were staring at me, their eyes wide with horror, waiting for my reaction, waiting for my son to intervene and protect his father. I slowly turned my gaze to Derek. He is 35 years old, a man who has never known what it means to miss a meal, to struggle to pay a utility bill, or to genuinely fear the future. He was standing just 3 feet away. I looked deeply into his eyes, silently begging him to step forward, to rip the microphone from his out-of-control wife, to demand respect for his 70-year-old father. But Derek did not step forward. He looked at me, looked at the terrified crowd, and instead of defending me, he let out a loud, awkward laugh that violently cut through the silence. He walked over, grabbed my shoulder tightly, and leaned his face toward the microphone. He looked at me and said, "Come on, old man, do not be grumpy, do not ruin the vibe of our party." He actually laughed. He endorsed her physical and emotional abuse in front of 150 people, just to save face and keep the party going. In that singular, terrifying moment, something inside my chest simply stopped beating. It did not break. It did not shatter into grief. It just turned to absolute ice. All the years of unconditional love, all the massive financial bailouts, all the sacrifices I made for his future, they completely vanished into the humid night air. I reached up and slowly wiped the drop of blood from the corner of my mouth with my thumb. I looked at the dark red smear on my skin. Then I looked at Derek, and then at Monica. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum, flip a table, or curse them. I simply turned around and walked away. I walked across the perfectly manicured lawn, through the massive iron security gates, and out into the warm Dallas night. The silence behind me was heavy and absolute. They thought they had successfully put a clueless, disposable old man in his place. They had absolutely no idea that by allowing that profound humiliation, they had just sealed their own absolute destruction. The morning sun crept through the wide blinds of my bedroom, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feeling the heavy ache in my jaw, before I even opened my eyes. The right side of my face was visibly swollen, incredibly tender to the touch, a physical reminder of the sheer disrespect I had endured the night before. I walked slowly into the kitchen to brew my coffee. The silence of the house was usually a great comfort to me, a peaceful space I had cultivated since my beloved wife passed. But today, the silence felt remarkably thick and suffocating. I poured the dark roast into my favorite ceramic mug, watching the steam rise toward the ceiling. My mind kept violently replaying the sound of laughter echoing across the patio. My own son had laughed at my humiliation. The shrill ring of my cell phone abruptly shattered the quiet morning air. The caller ID flashed Derek on the screen. I stood there, and let it ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. I did not say a single word. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited. "Hey, Dad," Derek said. His voice was incredibly casual, carrying the breezy, unbothered tone of a man who thought we were just going to discuss the weather or the local sports scores. "Listen about last night. Monica feels absolutely terrible. She had way too much vintage champagne. You know how those upscale parties get. People get caught up in the moment. You walked out of the yard so fast, we did not even get a chance to explain." I gripped the edge of the cool granite counter. Explain what Derek explained exactly why my daughter-in-law struck me 10 times across the face in front of half the city. Derek let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, the specific kind of sigh a frustrated parent gives a stubborn child. "Dad, come on! It was a comedy roast. The whole point of the game is to push boundaries. You are taking this way too personally. You have always been a little too sensitive about jokes. Monica loves you. She was just playing to the crowd to get a reaction. Do not make this into some massive family drama." "I am too sensitive," I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of his spoken words sink deeply into my bones. He was actively gaslighting me, attempting to rewrite the brutal reality of what I had physically experienced into a mere emotional overreaction on my part. "Exactly." Derek continued, his tone brightening considerably, as if we had just solved a minor misunderstanding. "Look, we are heading out for our 3-week luxury vacation in the Maldives very soon. Monica is actually coming over to your house right now to drop something off and apologize in person. Just hear her out, okay? Do not hold a petty grudge. See you later, Dad." He hung up the phone before I could offer any reply. I stared blankly at the dark screen of my device. The audacity was truly breathtaking. They honestly believed a forced, insincere apology could easily wipe away the profound humiliation they had meticulously orchestrated. 20 minutes later, the heavy thud of the brass knocker echoed loudly through the front hall. I opened the door to find Monica standing casually on my porch. She looked impeccably styled, wearing a crisp white designer blouse and holding a large wooden box tied with a thick gold ribbon. Her face was arranged perfectly into a mask of deep contrition. "Richard, I am so incredibly sorry," she said softly, stepping inside the house without waiting for a formal invitation. She walked straight into the main kitchen and set the heavy box on the center island. "I brought you this premium imported red ginseng. I know how much you value your health and wellness. It is the absolute best quality available on the market." I looked down at the wooden box. I recognized the luxury brand instantly. It was a high-end health supplement that cost roughly $800. I also knew exactly how she had paid for it. It was charged directly to the secondary black card linked to my primary business account, the specific card I had given Derek strictly for unexpected household emergencies. She had used my own hard-earned money to buy me an apology gift for physically assaulting me. "I drank far too much, Richard," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with highly practiced emotion. "The intense stress of organizing the vow renewal party just got to me. I thought I was being hilarious, but I obviously crossed a serious line. I truly hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I looked deeply into her eyes. There was absolutely no genuine remorse resting there. Beneath the rehearsed sadness, I could clearly see a cold, calculating impatience. She was merely going through the mandatory motions to ensure the bank of Richard remained wide open for their upcoming travels. "Is that right?" I said quietly, taking a deliberate sip of my black coffee. "Yes, absolutely." She nodded quickly. She reached into her oversized designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slid it smoothly across the surface of the granite counter toward me. "And actually, while I'm here, Derek and I were hoping you could take care of some very quick paperwork. Just minor housekeeping before we leave for the island resort." I stared at the thick folder. "What is this, Monica?" She offered a sweet, saccharine smile that did not reach her eyes. It is just a standard medical proxy document. Derek and I were talking last night, and we are just so worried about you, Richard. You live all alone in this massive empty house, and honestly, you have been so forgetful lately. Ever since your beautiful wife passed away, we have noticed you slipping a bit mentally. We just want to make sure someone is legally authorized to make emergency health decisions for you, just in case something terrible happens while we are halfway across the world. I kept my facial expression perfectly neutral, but my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. Forgetful slipping. I run a highly complex commercial real estate portfolio. I negotiate multi-million-dollar property development contracts every single week. My mind is sharper than a razor blade. Furthermore, I had just completed a comprehensive physical examination with my private physician 2 weeks ago. My health is absolutely pristine. The narrative she was weaving was a complete fabrication, a deliberate setup. I slowly opened the cover of the folder. The dense legal jargon on the very first page jumped out at me immediately. It was a comprehensive legal instrument designed to strip me of my rights. I picked up my heavy ceramic coffee mug. I brought it upward toward my lips, pretending to take another slow sip. Then, with a calculated twitch of my wrist, I let the mug slip completely from my grasp. The hot coffee splashed violently across the counter, instantly ruining the documents. The facade cracked. Monica gasped loudly, jumping back as the dark liquid pooled across the kitchen island and soaked the thick paper. She frantically grabbed a handful of paper towels, dabbing at the ruined document with a look of pure fury flashing across her face. I offered a slow, deliberate apology, playing the role of the clumsy old man to absolute perfection. I told her my hands just were not as steady as they used to be, especially after a stressful night. She glared at me, her chest heaving with barely contained anger. She muttered something under her breath about how careless I was, snatched up her designer bag, and stormed out the front door without another word. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, rattling the glass panes in the entryway. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, my entire demeanor shifted. I was not a fragile old man. I was a survivor who had navigated the cutthroat world of commercial real estate for 40 years. I carefully peeled the coffee-soaked pages from the granite counter. The ink was slightly blurred in several places, but the dense legal text was still entirely readable. I folded the damp document and placed it into a clear plastic folder. Within 10 minutes, I was behind the wheel of my car, driving straight toward the downtown business district. The morning traffic was heavy, but my mind was moving much faster than the vehicles surrounding me. I bypassed my own corporate headquarters and pulled into the underground parking garage of an imposing glass and steel skyscraper. This was the domain of Thomas Bradley. Thomas was my primary corporate attorney, a man I had known and trusted for nearly 3 decades. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly devoid of sentimentality when it came to business affairs. He was exactly the kind of man you wanted in your corner when the knives came out in the dark. I bypassed his reception desk with a brief nod to his assistant and walked directly into his spacious corner office. Thomas looked up from his dual monitors, his sharp gray eyes instantly recognizing the absolute gravity of my expression. I tossed the plastic folder onto his polished mahogany desk. I told him my daughter-in-law had just tried to slip this document past me under the guise of a simple medical proxy, and I needed him to tell me exactly what it really was. Thomas carefully extracted the damp pages. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and began to read. The silence in the spacious office stretched on for several long, agonizing minutes. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his eyes scan back and forth across the fine print. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was completely devoid of its usual professional detachment. It was replaced by a look of profound, chilling concern. He placed the pages flat on his desk and told me that this was absolutely not a medical proxy. He explained that it was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. If I had blindly signed that piece of paper, I would have surrendered complete legal and financial control of my entire life over to Derek and Monica. Thomas pointed to specific clauses buried deep within the convoluted legal jargon. He translated the dense text into brutal, terrifying reality. He explained that they would have the unilateral authority to liquidate my massive investment portfolios without my consent. They could sell off my commercial properties, empty my personal bank accounts, and completely restrict my access to my own financial advisors. I would be left completely penniless and legally powerless. But the absolute worst part was buried on the final page of the document. Thomas tapped his silver pen against the wet paper and explained that they had included a highly specific ironclad provision. This specific clause granted them the ultimate legal power to declare me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They would be legally authorized to forcefully commit me to an assisted living facility against my will without requiring any secondary medical evaluation from an independent doctor. The blood drained completely from my face, leaving me cold and utterly numb. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. My own son was not just trying to steal my hard-earned wealth. He was systematically planning to erase my fundamental freedom as a human being. He wanted to lock me away in a secure facility where I could never interfere with his lavish lifestyle. He wanted me out of sight and out of mind, left to rot in a sterile room, while he spent the fortune I had spent 4 decades building. Thomas leaned forward, folding his hands together tightly on the surface of his desk. He asked me a very simple, incredibly terrifying question. He asked how much direct financial control Derek currently held within my corporate enterprise. I closed my eyes and let out a long, heavy breath. I did not need to recount my entire business history to understand the massive vulnerability I had foolishly created. 3 years ago, I had handed Derek the keys to a highly lucrative subsidiary firm under my corporate umbrella. It was supposed to be a safe training ground, a structured place for him to prove his executive capabilities before eventually taking over the parent company. I had given him full operational control, complete access to the subsidiary bank accounts, and a significant degree of autonomy to make major financial decisions. I had trusted him implicitly because he was my own flesh and blood. I had believed that giving him responsibility would naturally foster maturity and gratitude. I opened my eyes and looked at Thomas, the crushing realization washing over me like a physical blow. If Derek and Monica were bold enough to try and trick me into signing away my human rights right in my own kitchen, they were absolutely not waiting around patiently for a future inheritance. The sheer audacity of their plan meant they were already deeply entrenched in some kind of severe financial manipulation. They needed total, unquestioned control over my entire estate to cover up something massive that they had already done. They needed me out of the way before I discovered their secrets. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly falling into place, painting a picture of deceit that went far deeper than a humiliating slap at a party. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, feeling a cold, calculated clarity wash away any remaining traces of fatherly hesitation or grief. I looked Thomas directly in the eye and gave him a single uncompromising order. I told him to deploy our most aggressive forensic accounting team immediately. I wanted a complete shadow audit of Derek's subsidiary division launched before the end of the day. I wanted every ledger scrutinized, every offshore wire transfer tracked, every vendor invoice verified, and every single digital communication meticulously torn apart. I told Thomas to dig relentlessly until he hit the very bottom of their financial lies. I was completely ready to uncover the absolute truth today, regardless of exactly how much destruction it was going to cause to my entire family. I walked out of Thomas's downtown office and stepped into the blistering afternoon heat of Dallas. The sheer gravity of what I had just initiated rested heavily on my shoulders. I was formally declaring war on my own flesh and blood. I unlocked the door of my luxury sedan, sliding into the driver's seat. For a long time, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel. I needed to construct a flawless trap. If I confronted Derek immediately with my suspicions, he would panic. He would instantly destroy documents, move hidden funds, and rally a defense team to drag me into a protracted legal battle. I could not afford a messy skirmish. I needed total, absolute victory. I needed them completely isolated and entirely unawares. I closed my eyes and summoned a very specific version of myself. I dug deep into the past, pulling up the ruthless, unyielding real estate developer I was in the 1980s. Back then, I faced down corporate sharks and predatory investors who tried to bleed my company dry. The golden rule of those negotiations was simple. Never let the opposition know you possess the upper hand until the trap has completely snapped shut. I took a deep, steadying breath and completely softened my posture. I practiced relaxing my jaw, letting a tremble seep into my vocal cords. I picked up my phone and dialed my son's number. Derek answered on the second ring. His tone was brisk and dripping with an unearned authority. He asked me if I had reviewed the medical paperwork Monica had dropped off earlier that morning. I did not snap. I did not yell. Instead, I let out a long, fragile sigh, ensuring the microphone caught the manufactured weariness in my breath. I told him that I had looked at the documents, but my eyes were just so tired lately. I murmured that the dense legal text was giving me a terrible headache. I painted the exact picture he desperately wanted to see. I portrayed a broken, exhausted, lonely man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. I heard a slight, eager shift in his breathing. He pressed the issue gently but firmly, insisting that it was for my own good, suggesting that he could drive over and help me sign it right then. I stopped him softly. I told him that I was simply too exhausted to deal with legal matters today. Then I dangled the ultimate bait. I reminded him that their highly anticipated anniversary vacation to the Maldives was approaching rapidly. I told him that I wanted them to leave immediately. I insisted that they take 3 full weeks to celebrate their beautiful marriage entirely on my dime. I promised him that the very minute they returned from their tropical paradise, I would gladly sign every single document they placed in front of me. I told him I just wanted my son to handle my heavy burdens, so I could finally rest in peace. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with greedy calculation. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He was weighing the immediate gratification of a free, wildly expensive luxury vacation against the slight delay in acquiring total legal control over my estate. The sheer arrogance of his entitlement won effortlessly. He adopted a tone of mock concern, telling me to get plenty of rest and promising that they would fly out the very next morning. We exchanged hollow pleasantries, and I hung up the phone. I sat in my car and smiled. The predators firmly believed they had successfully cornered their wounded prey. Over the next 48 hours, I sat quietly in my study and monitored my financial alerts. I watched with clinical detachment as Derek and Monica shamelessly drained my accounts to finance their extravagant departure. The credit card notifications rolled in like clockwork. They booked 2 round-trip first-class tickets to the Maldives, costing roughly $24,000. They upgraded their overwater villa to a premium presidential suite. They charged thousands of dollars at luxury boutiques in the airport terminal, purchasing designer sunglasses and premium luggage for a trip they had not even earned. They purchased heavily overpriced vintage champagne for their flight. They bought an entirely new wardrobe of tropical resort wear without a second thought. They even booked a private yacht transfer from the main island airport to their secluded resort, entirely oblivious to the reality that they were paying for their own ultimate demise. I did not block a single transaction. I let them spend my money freely, knowing that every dollar they stole was just adding another layer of concrete to the inescapable tomb I was meticulously building for them. I wanted them as far away from Dallas as physically possible. I wanted them stranded on a tiny strip of sand in the middle of the Indian Ocean, completely isolated from their local banking contacts and legal resources. I needed them trapped in a paradise that was about to transform into an absolute nightmare. On Thursday morning, I sat by the large bay window in my living room drinking my black coffee. I tracked their international flight using a public aviation application on my tablet. I watched the tiny digital airplane icon depart from the local runway, ascend to cruising altitude, and begin its long, uninterrupted journey across the globe. They were finally in the air. The trapdoor had officially slammed shut behind them. They were completely unreachable for the next 18 hours. I allowed myself a brief moment of profound relief. The toxic energy they brought into my world was temporarily gone. But there was no time to celebrate. The real work was just beginning. Exactly 45 minutes after their flight cleared American airspace, my private cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. I looked at the caller identification. It was Thomas. I answered the call immediately. Thomas did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. His voice was grim, completely stripped of any professional buffer. He told me that the forensic accounting team had finalized their initial shadow audit of Derek's subsidiary division. He warned me that the situation was catastrophically worse than we had originally anticipated. He told me to come down to his office right away because I needed to see the brutal numbers with my own eyes. I hung up the phone, put on my suit jacket, and walked out the door, ready to face the absolute devastation of my son's betrayal. I drove back into the city with a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The Dallas skyline loomed ahead of me, a towering monument to the decades of relentless sacrifice I had made to ensure my family would never experience the crushing poverty I had grown up in. Every building I passed reminded me of the blood I had poured into my business. I parked my vehicle and took the private elevator directly up to the executive suite. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft, metallic chime. I walked straight past the reception desk and into the massive main conference room. Thomas was standing at the head of the long mahogany table when I entered. The room was bathed in the harsh, sterile light of the afternoon sun, reflecting off the neighboring glass skyscrapers. The entire surface of the massive table was covered in neat, meticulously organized stacks of financial documents, bank statements, and printed transaction logs. Thomas did not offer me a seat. He simply gestured to the papers with a tight, rigid expression. I walked over and stood beside him, looking down at the physical evidence of my own son's absolute moral bankruptcy. Thomas took a deep breath and began to explain exactly what his forensic accounting team had uncovered over the last 48 hours. He told me that Derek had not simply been mismanaging the subsidiary firm due to incompetence or inexperience. He had been actively, systematically bleeding the company dry for the better part of 2 years. Thomas slid a thick ledger toward me, tapping a specific column of numbers with his index finger. He explained that Derek had set up a complex web of shell companies and dummy vendor accounts. He had been filtering company profits through these fictitious entities, classifying them as legitimate operational expenses. But the money was not going toward business development or employee salaries. It was being funneled directly into unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. Derek had been gambling with my corporate funds on highly volatile digital assets. He had lost catastrophically. The total amount of embezzled capital was staggering. $2 million had been completely vaporized. My son had stolen $2 million of my wealth to cover his reckless, secret gambling addiction. I felt a cold, heavy weight settle deep in my stomach. The financial loss was substantial, but the sheer scale of the deception was what truly made me feel physically ill. I looked at Thomas, shaking my head in disbelief. I asked him how Derek had managed to hide such a massive deficit from the internal auditors for so long. Thomas explained that Derek had been leveraging my pristine reputation in the commercial real estate sector. He had used my name and my corporate standing to secure high-risk short-term loans to artificially inflate the subsidiary's quarterly balance sheets. He was playing a dangerous, highly illegal game of financial musical chairs, constantly shifting debt to create the illusion of profitability. He was relying entirely on the fact that I trusted him too much to ever look closely at the granular details of his operations. I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I had handed him a golden opportunity, a clear path to building his own legitimate legacy, and he had treated it like a personal casino. But Thomas was not finished. He reached across the table and pulled a separate, much smaller folder from the bottom of a stack. He told me that the embezzlement was not the only financial crime they had uncovered. He opened the folder and placed a series of vendor invoices and bank transfer receipts in front of me. They were all dated from the previous month. Thomas explained that his team had cross-referenced my personal credit card expenditures with the actual vendor payouts from Derek and Monica's lavish vow renewal party. I stared at the receipts, recognizing the names of the caterers, the florists, and the event planners from that terrible night in the garden. I had personally authorized a budget of $150,000 for that party. I had paid the money directly into a joint checking account that Monica had specifically set up to manage the event expenses. Thomas pointed to the highlighted transfer amounts. The actual verified cost of the entire party was only $50,000. Derek and Monica had colluded with a few shady vendors to generate heavily inflated fraudulent invoices to show me. Once I transferred the full amount, they paid the real costs and quietly pocketed the remaining $100,000 in cash. They had scammed me out of a small fortune just so they could throw a party where they publicly humiliated and physically assaulted me. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the scam left me entirely speechless. They had engineered a scenario where I paid them a massive premium for the privilege of being slapped in the face in front of 150 people. The vow renewal was never about celebrating their marriage or solidifying their commitment. It was a calculated theatrical cash grab, a coordinated strike against an old man they viewed merely as a bottomless bank account. I felt a surge of hot, unadulterated anger rise in my chest, completely burning away the lingering traces of fatherly grief. I looked at Thomas and told him I wanted to press formal criminal charges immediately. I wanted Derek arrested for the $2 million corporate embezzlement, and I wanted Monica charged for the wire fraud regarding the party funds. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression remaining incredibly grave. He told me that we had more than enough actionable evidence to send them both to federal prison for a very long time. However, he cautioned me that a public criminal trial would inevitably drag my company name through the mud and potentially alert the short-term lenders to the subsidiary's massive financial instability. He advised me to handle the asset recovery and the punishment privately, using the threat of criminal prosecution to force their total surrender. I considered his words carefully. A quiet, devastating execution was exactly what I preferred. I did not want a public spectacle. I wanted total, absolute ruination on my own terms. I wanted to dismantle their entire lives piece by piece. I told Thomas to prepare the civil lawsuits and draft the termination papers for Derek. I wanted everything ready to file the moment they returned from their tropical vacation. But as I turned to leave the conference room, Thomas held up his hand. He told me to wait. He said that the financial crimes were severe, but there was one more piece of evidence I needed to see before I decided on my final course of action. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a single printed sheet of paper. He slid it slowly across the polished wood, pushing it until it stopped right at the edge of the table in front of me. He explained that his tech team had recovered a deleted email from Monica. I picked up the piece of paper. The harsh fluorescent lighting above illuminated the black text. It was an email exchange between Monica and the admissions director of a state-run, highly restrictive nursing facility located in a remote, depressed area 3 hours outside of Dallas. It was the kind of place that had a terrible reputation, a dark facility known for taking in wards of the state and keeping them heavily medicated and locked away from normal society. The chilling email was dated just 2 days before their extravagant vow renewal party. I silently read the cruel words Monica had typed with her own hands. She was explicitly asking them to reserve a permanent bed for me today. I held the crisp sheet of paper closer to my face, my eyes scanning the harsh black text printed across the page. The email was addressed directly to the facility administrator. Monica had written that her father-in-law was experiencing rapid, severe cognitive decline and was becoming increasingly difficult to manage at home. She stated that they would be dropping me off early next month, immediately following their return from their extended vacation in the Maldives. But the logistical details were not the most horrifying part of her message. It was the specific, calculated instructions she had outlined in the second paragraph. She explicitly requested that I be placed immediately into their highly restricted memory care ward. She instructed the staff to confiscate my personal cell phone, upon intake, citing a fabricated tendency for me to make confused, harassing calls to distant relatives. She even went so far as to mandate that my visitation rights be strictly limited to only herself and Derek, effectively cutting off any potential contact I might have with my legal counsel or outside financial advisors. They were not simply planning to steal my bank accounts. They were meticulously designing a permanent, isolated prison for me. The sheer weight of that realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I slowly lowered the paper to the desk, my hands trembling slightly, as the full scope of their malicious intent settled deeply into my bones. For 40 years, I had poured every ounce of my physical and emotional energy into providing for my son. I had sacrificed my own comfort, working grueling 80-hour weeks, missing countless personal milestones, just to ensure Derek would never have to experience the suffocating grip of poverty that I had endured as a young man. I had paid for his elite private schooling, funded his university tuition in full, and handed him a lucrative executive position on a silver platter. I had given him the world, and in return, he had quietly conspired with his wife to strip away my basic human dignity. They were perfectly willing to lock me inside a sterile, heavily medicated cage, leaving me to rot in total isolation while they joyfully spent the fortune I had bled to build. It was an act of cruelty so profound, so utterly devoid of basic human empathy, that my mind struggled to fully process the betrayal. The memory of the vow renewal party flashed vividly behind my eyes. I remembered Derek laughing as Monica struck my face. I remembered the heavy, mocking tone in his voice. He knew. He knew exactly what they were planning to do to me the entire time he was smiling and drinking the expensive champagne I had paid for. As I sat there in the silent, heavily air-conditioned office, something fundamental broke inside of me. The deep, agonizing grief that usually accompanies such a profound family betrayal simply evaporated. It was completely replaced by a pure, absolute, glacial resolve. The warm, forgiving heart of a loving father hardened into solid ice. I realized in that exact moment that the man I had raised no longer existed. The son I had loved unconditionally was entirely gone, replaced by a greedy, parasitic stranger who viewed my continued existence as nothing more than a temporary hurdle to his own financial gratification. They had made a calculated decision to treat this as a war for resources, and they had arrogantly assumed that I was too weak and too old to fight back. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a sudden surge of sharp, terrifying clarity. I was no longer a victim. I was the founder of a massive corporate empire, a man who had spent decades ruthlessly outmaneuvering some of the most cutthroat developers in the state of Texas. If Derek and Monica wanted a war, I was going to give them an absolute massacre. I looked up at Thomas. He was watching me closely, his sharp eyes reading the dramatic shift in my posture. He had known me long enough to recognize the exact moment my corporate instincts overrode my personal emotions. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands carefully. He told me that if Monica had successfully tricked me into signing that power of attorney document in my kitchen, this evil email would have been her legally binding instruction manual. Because I had unknowingly granted Derek so much unchecked autonomy within the subsidiary firm, establishing a baseline narrative of my supposed mental decline would have been terrifyingly easy for them to accomplish in front of a sympathetic judge. They had orchestrated a nearly flawless legal trap, relying entirely on my paternal blind spot. Thomas told me that we had narrowly avoided an absolute catastrophe. He asked me, his voice steady and completely serious, how far I was willing to go to rectify the situation. He needed to know if I was ready to pull the trigger on the defensive measures we had discussed, or if I still harbored any lingering desires to confront them privately and seek an amicable family resolution. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I told Thomas there would be no private conversations, no family mediation, and absolutely no mercy. I ordered him to initiate the legal slaughter. I wanted every single connection to my wealth permanently severed by the time the sun went down. I wanted the civil lawsuits for the $2 million corporate embezzlement filed immediately ensuring the public record would permanently reflect Derek's criminal incompetence. I wanted his employment at my firm terminated with extreme prejudice, cutting off his massive salary and his premium health benefits without a single day of severance pay. Furthermore, I instructed Thomas to formally draft a complete and total disinheritance document. I wanted Derek completely scrubbed from my final will and testament, replaced entirely by various local charitable organizations. I told Thomas that when Derek and Monica finally returned from their luxury vacation, I wanted them to return to absolutely nothing. But before we could freeze the corporate accounts and cancel their black cards, there was one specific massive asset that needed to be aggressively handled. I looked at Thomas and asked him to pull up the master files for the Campbell Family Trust. The sprawling Dallas mansion that Derek and Monica constantly flaunted on their social media accounts was the crown jewel of their arrogant lifestyle. They loved hosting extravagant parties, boasting to their wealthy friends about the custom renovations and the expensive imported finishes. They paraded around the massive estate like they had personally built it from the ground up. However, their profound entitlement had blinded them to a very crucial legal reality. They had completely ignored the fundamental details hidden deep within the original property paperwork. Derek did not hold the actual deed to that magnificent $3 million property. He had never owned a single square inch of the pristine landscaping or the grand architecture. The true ownership of their beloved sanctuary rested safely within my ironclad portfolio. I took a quiet, deeply satisfying breath, watching my lawyer load the confidential property files onto his screen. Thomas clicked a few keys on his sleek keyboard, and the high-resolution images of the sprawling Dallas estate filled the large monitor mounted on the office wall. It was a magnificent property, a massive stone structure sitting on 2 acres of perfectly manicured land in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the entire state of Texas. For the past 3 years, Monica had used that house as her personal backdrop for endless social media content. She posted daily photographs of herself lounging by the infinity pool, sipping expensive wine in the custom chef's kitchen, and hosting lavish dinner parties in the formal dining room. She relentlessly promoted the false narrative that she and Derek were highly successful self-made entrepreneurs who had earned every single luxury they possessed. They constantly bragged to their shallow circle of friends about the massive real estate investment they had supposedly made. But the beautiful, undeniable truth of the matter was that neither Derek nor Monica had ever contributed a single penny toward the acquisition of that $3.5 million estate. Their grand illusion of ownership was built entirely upon a foundation of my quiet generosity and their staggering, willful ignorance of basic legal documentation. When they originally picked out the property, Derek had come to me asking for a simple loan to cover the massive down payment. I had known even back then that his financial habits were deeply flawed, so I had taken a much more protective route. Instead of simply writing him a personal check, I purchased the property outright in cash. However, I did not put the deed in his name, nor did I put it in Monica's name. The property was legally purchased and completely owned by the Campbell Family Trust. I am the sole absolute executor of that trust, to give them the illusion of independence and to allow them to save their own money. I had my legal team draft a highly specific residential lease agreement. I allowed Derek and Monica to live in the magnificent mansion for the exact cost of $1 single per year. It was the ultimate safety net, a massive gift designed to let them build their lives without the crushing burden of a massive monthly mortgage payment. But like all heavily subsidized gifts from a seasoned corporate developer, the lease agreement came with a very dense, incredibly binding set of terms and conditions. Derek was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate eagerness to move into the prestigious neighborhood that he had barely glanced at the paperwork before scrawling his signature across the bottom line. He simply assumed it was a meaningless formality required by his wealthy father. He had never bothered to hire his own attorney to review the fine print. If he had actually read the dense legal text, he would have discovered the absolute unconditional power I retained over the property. Thomas zoomed in on a specific section of the digital document, highlighting a thick paragraph in bright yellow. He turned to me, his sharp eyes gleaming with the cold, precise satisfaction of a lawyer who has just found the perfect legal weapon. He explained that we had included a very specific moral turpitude and criminal negligence clause deep within the strict behavioral requirements of the residential lease. It was a standard protective measure I used in all my commercial properties, adapted perfectly for this specific family arrangement. Thomas read the highlighted text aloud. The clause explicitly stated that any proven act of financial malfeasance, embezzlement, or severe criminal negligence committed by the tenant against the landlord or the landlord's affiliated corporate entities would result in the immediate non-negotiable termination of the lease agreement. Because Derek had methodically embezzled $2 million from the subsidiary firm that I completely owned, he had fundamentally breached the core requirement of his residency. He had essentially evicted himself the very moment he wired my stolen corporate funds into his secret cryptocurrency accounts. Thomas folded his hands on the desk and delivered the final devastating legal conclusion. Because the termination was based on severe financial crimes against the property owner standard, tenant protection laws did not apply in the same manner. We did not have to grant them a 30-day notice. We did not have to endure a protracted, messy eviction process through the local housing courts. The forfeiture of the property was immediate and absolute. The moment I signed the termination order, they were legally considered hostile trespassers on my private estate. I leaned back heavily in the highly comfortable leather chair, letting the sheer brilliance of the legal trap wash over me. I pictured Monica and Derek thousands of miles away, completely isolated in their incredibly expensive overwater villa in the Maldives. I imagined Monica lying on a pristine white sand beach, wearing her new designer sunglasses, casually sipping a cold martini under the bright tropical sun. I imagined Derek sitting beside her, checking his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire kingdom was rapidly crumbling into dust back in Texas. They were celebrating their supposed victory, thinking they had successfully secured their lavish future by tricking a senile old man. They thought they had outsmarted the very person who had taught them everything they knew about money. The profound contrast between their current blissful ignorance and the absolute devastation waiting for them was almost poetic. They were kings of a castle that no longer existed. Their entire reality was nothing more than a fragile mirage, and I held the needle ready to burst their comfortable bubble. I looked back at the large monitor studying the beautiful facade of the stone mansion. It was a stunning property, but it was now completely tainted by their overwhelming greed and their malicious, unforgivable plots against my freedom. I no longer wanted to own it. I did not want to step foot inside those walls ever again. I turned my attention back to Thomas and gave him my next set of uncompromising instructions. I told him to execute the immediate termination of the lease right now. I wanted the formal eviction notice filed electronically before the hour was over. Furthermore, I ordered him to contact our most aggressive private real estate broker immediately. I did not want to list the mansion on the public market where it would sit for months, enduring endless showings and tedious negotiations. I told Thomas to offer the property exclusively to our private network of high-net-worth cash buyers. I instructed him to list the $3.5 million estate for a massive, undeniable discount of $2.8 million. I wanted it priced so aggressively low that a very eager cash buyer would snatch it up instantly without ever giving it a single second thought. My ultimate condition was that the sale had to be completely closed and the title fully transferred within 5 business days. I wanted the house sold, the locks permanently changed, and the entire property legally handed over to a complete total stranger long before their return flight from the Indian Ocean ever touched the concrete ground in Dallas. The very next morning, I stood in the expansive, circular driveway of the sprawling Dallas estate. The brutal Texas sun was already beating down rapidly, heating the pristine white concrete beneath my feet. I held a steaming cup of dark black coffee in one hand and the legally binding termination of lease order tightly in the other. At precisely 8 o'clock, a massive rumbling moving truck pulled slowly through the iron security gates. I had not hired a boutique white-glove moving service that specialized in gently handling delicate antiques and priceless modern art. I had hired a heavy-duty, no-nonsense industrial crew that usually handled rapid office liquidations and severe corporate foreclosures. 4 burly men stepped out of the wide cab carrying thick rolls of packing tape and huge stacks of flattened generic cardboard boxes. The foreman, a towering, broad-shouldered man named Javier, walked directly up to me, removed his thick leather work gloves, and asked for his daily instructions. I handed him the master key to the front door. I told him I needed the entire 3-level property completely emptied by sundown. I was very explicit in my directions. I told him they did not need to use bubble wrap for the shoes, they did not need to use garment bags for the suits, and they certainly did not need to treat any of the personal belongings with any degree of reverence. I instructed them to simply put the items into the boxes, tape them shut, and load them into the back of the truck as quickly as humanly possible. Javier nodded, completely unfazed by the coldness of the order, and signaled his men to begin the sweep. I followed them inside the grand foyer, watching as they marched up the sweeping double staircase with heavy thudding boots. I walked slowly into the vast master suite, standing quietly in the doorway of Monica's sprawling, custom-built walk-in closet. It was an absolute monument to her profound vanity. There were long rows upon rows of imported Italian leather shoes, custom wooden shelves lined with rare silk scarves, and a massive glass display case holding at least a dozen pristine designer handbags. Each of those bags cost significantly more than a reliable used car. I watched with deep, quiet satisfaction as the rough, moving crew ruthlessly dismantled her pristine, highly organized sanctuary. They grabbed the incredibly expensive Chanel and Hermès purses by their delicate gold chains and tossed them unceremoniously into the dirty bottom of a rough brown cardboard box. They swept the imported shoes off the shelves in massive handfuls, dumping them into bins without matching the pairs. There was no soft tissue paper, no protective silk dust bags, just the incredibly harsh, unyielding reality of their highly prized material possessions being treated exactly like cheap, entirely disposable garbage. I moved across the hall into Derek's private dressing room. His collection of luxury timepieces sat on a velvet-lined display tray. There were heavy gold Rolexes and sleek silver Patek Philippe's, all purchased with the corporate funds he had systematically embezzled from my subsidiary firm. One of the movers asked me if he should find a secure lockbox for the jewelry. I told him to throw them directly into a standard plastic bin, along with Derek's gym socks and golf shirts. Watching those incredibly expensive symbols of their stolen wealth being dumped into cheap cardboard boxes felt remarkably cleansing. The grand illusion of their self-made untouchable success was being physically dismantled and stripped away piece by piece right before my eyes. By 4 o'clock in the late afternoon, the massive industrial truck was completely and securely loaded. The moving crew tightly secured the heavy metal door at the back and quickly prepared for departure. I had not rented a premium climate-controlled storage facility in a nice, safe part of town to properly protect their delicate luxury leather and highly sensitive electronics. I had rented the absolute cheapest, lowest-tier storage unit available anywhere, located directly next to a remarkably noisy, dusty highway overpass on the extreme industrial outskirts of the sprawling city. The small storage unit had raw concrete floors, cheap corrugated tin walls, and absolutely no functioning temperature regulation whatsoever. The brutal Texas heat would turn that metal box into a suffocating oven within hours, baking the designer clothes and warping the expensive custom furniture. I calmly paid Javier his full fee in cash, handed him the printed address to the remote storage facility, and firmly told him to securely lock the metal roll-up door when he was finally finished. I stayed behind, standing completely alone in the center of the massive, empty living room. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was expansive and remarkably pure. I walked through the echoing halls, my dress shoes clicking sharply against the imported marble floors. I trailed my hand along the cool stone of the fireplace mantel. This space had been tainted by their toxic entitlement, by their endless mocking, and by their terrifying plots against my freedom. Now it was just an empty shell. I was reclaiming the space that my sweat, my long hours, and my physical sacrifices had paid for. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of cleaning supplies and fresh air coming through the open patio doors, feeling a profound sense of ownership return to my spirit. The final phase of the brutal real estate trap snapped shut with truly staggering efficiency. Thomas had aggressively reached out to his highly exclusive private network of high-net-worth investors, actively marketing the $3.5 million property for the steeply discounted price of $2.8 million. Within exactly 48 hours, a wealthy corporate developer submitted a clean all-cash offer without requiring any lengthy property inspections or frustrating bank financing contingencies. We eagerly accepted the aggressive cash offer immediately. The complex escrow process was forcefully fast-tracked. The extensive legal paperwork was rapidly pushed to the absolute front of the line, and the entire massive transaction successfully closed within 5 short, highly efficient days. The moment the massive sum of cash officially cleared the secure banking wire, I dispatched a local locksmith to the property. He swiftly removed all the digital smart locks that Derek had proudly installed, replacing them with heavy physical deadbolts and issuing the shiny new keys directly to the new buyer. The luxurious nest they had so arrogantly claimed as their own was entirely legally gone. The physical erasure was now finally and completely finished. Their expensive designer clothes were baking in a cheap metal box, their stolen luxury watches were tossed carelessly in plastic bins, and the beautiful mansion they used to constantly impress their shallow socialite friends belonged exclusively to a total stranger. I sat alone in my quiet home office, staring intensely at my bright computer screen. I had successfully dismantled their physical sanctuary while they were still blindly drinking sweet cocktails on a distant sunny island. But I was absolutely not finished with them yet. It was time to aggressively cut their financial oxygen and watch them completely suffocate. The very next morning, I initiated the total financial blackout. I sat across from Thomas in my study, the grand mahogany desk acting as the command center for our silent war. My instructions were precise, ruthless, and highly methodical. First, we completely liquidated every single corporate account that Derek had any level of access to. We transferred the remaining operating capital into a newly established, highly restricted holding account under my exclusive control. Next, I logged into my personal banking portals and permanently canceled all secondary platinum and black credit cards that I had ever issued to Derek and Monica. With a few simple clicks of a mouse, their infinite spending power was instantaneously evaporated. Thomas then presented the final employment termination papers. The document was meticulously drafted, explicitly citing severe criminal negligence, massive corporate embezzlement, and gross violation of fiduciary duty. I signed the heavy parchment with a smooth, deeply satisfying stroke of my pen. Derek was officially permanently fired with absolute cause. He would receive no severance package, no continuation of his premium health benefits, and absolutely no corporate recommendations. Immediately after I signed his professional death warrant, Thomas electronically filed the formal fraud charges with the local district attorney office. We submitted the comprehensive forensic audit, the fake vendor invoices from the vow renewal party, and the undeniable proof of the $2 million cryptocurrency losses. The legal guillotine had officially dropped. Derek was no longer a wealthy executive. He was an unemployed, highly indebted criminal suspect facing imminent prosecution. I leaned back in my chair and watched Thomas close his heavy briefcase. The initial trap was perfectly set. Now I simply had to wait for them to trigger the alarms. I turned my attention to the large monitor resting on the corner of my desk. I had opened a dedicated tracking application that actively monitored the GPS coordinates of the entire corporate vehicle fleet. Derek and Monica had been driving a pair of heavily customized, top-of-the-line Porsche luxury SUVs. They had specifically requested the premium leather interiors and the upgraded performance packages, arrogantly charging the massive monthly lease payments directly to the subsidiary firm operating budget. Because their employment was now officially terminated, With extreme prejudice, those highly expensive vehicles were legally required to be surrendered immediately. I had dispatched a specialized repossession team earlier that morning. I sat quietly in my study, watching the two blinking digital dots on the high-resolution digital map. The dots were parked side by side in the designated long-term luxury parking garage at the Dallas International Airport. I watched with quiet, profound satisfaction as the tracking application showed the dots suddenly begin to move. The repo men had successfully accessed the secure facility, hooked the heavy vehicles to their industrial tow trucks, and were currently hauling them back to the commercial dealership. Derek and Monica would return from their lavish vacation, expecting to slide into the comfortable air-conditioned leather seats of their expensive German sports cars. Instead, they would find an empty parking space and a heavy realization that their entire luxurious lifestyle had been completely dismantled while they were sipping champagne on an airplane. The physical erasure of their presence in my life was proceeding flawlessly. Every asset they had stolen, every privilege they had abused, was being aggressively clawed back. Halfway across the globe, the brilliant afternoon sun was sparkling beautifully over the crystal-clear waters of the Indian Ocean. Monica was strolling casually through the pristine air-conditioned pathways of the exclusive island resort. She was wearing a new, incredibly expensive silk resort dress, feeling like absolute royalty. She walked confidently into the premium designer boutique located near the main lobby. The small, elegantly lit store was filled with rare luxury goods, imported jewelry, and highly exclusive accessories designed specifically to tempt the tremendously wealthy guests. Monica zeroed in on a beautiful limited edition Chanel handbag resting perfectly on a lit glass display shelf. The price tag was a staggering $5,000. For a woman who was accustomed to treating my personal bank accounts like an endless wishing well, $5,000 was absolutely nothing. It was merely a casual afternoon impulse buy. She picked up the delicate leather bag, flashed an arrogant, entitled smile at the attentive sales clerk, and handed over her heavy metal black card. She did not even bother to look at the final receipt. She simply stood by the marble counter, waiting for the familiar, satisfying chime of an approved transaction. The clerk smoothly swiped the heavy metal card through the point-of-sale terminal. Instead of a pleasant chime, the machine emitted a harsh, flat rejection tone. The small digital screen boldly displayed a single devastating word: declined. The clerk frowned, apologizing profusely, and gently suggested that perhaps there was a minor security hold placed on the account due to the international travel location. Monica let out a dramatic, highly irritated sigh. She rolled her eyes, complaining loudly about the tremendous inconvenience. She quickly pulled out her sleek smartphone and dialed Derek, demanding that he come down to the boutique immediately to resolve the embarrassing financial error. Derek arrived a few minutes later, looking relaxed and mildly annoyed by the sudden interruption to his luxurious beachside afternoon. He was wearing expensive linen shorts and a premium gold watch that rightfully belonged to my company. He confidently approached the marble counter, offering the highly apologetic clerk a condescending smile. He smoothly pulled his own primary corporate platinum card from his designer leather wallet and handed it over, assuring Monica that he would handle the minor banking glitch. The clerk respectfully took the new card and carefully inserted the metal chip into the digital terminal. They all waited in a tense, expectant silence. The machine processed the information for a brief moment before emitting the exact same harsh, undeniable rejection tone: declined. His confident, arrogant smile instantly vanished. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. He quickly reached into his wallet and produced a third credit card, this one tied directly to their joint personal checking account. He slid the plastic card into the machine, his jaw tightening as the terminal processed the request. Declined. The terrible word flashed on the screen once again. The sales clerk looked at them with a mixture of polite concern and rising professional suspicion. Monica stared at Derek, her eyes widening in sudden, unadulterated panic. Derek frantically pulled out his phone and opened his mobile banking application, fully expecting to see millions of dollars resting safely in his accounts. Instead, he found absolutely nothing. Every single corporate login credential he possessed had been revoked. His personal accounts showed a balance of zero, entirely frozen, pending the active criminal fraud investigation. The tropical heat outside the boutique suddenly felt incredibly suffocating. The protective bubble of their stolen wealth had violently burst. They were stranded on a tiny, isolated island thousands of miles away from home, without a single functioning credit card, without a single dollar of accessible cash, and completely unawares that their absolute destruction had only just begun, and I was going to enjoy every second of their misery. 12 hours later, the gravity of their situation breached the walls of their premium villa. It was exactly 2 a.m. in the Maldives. The ocean lapping against their suite was interrupted by a sharp, authoritative knock on their mahogany front door. Derek and Monica had spent the evening trapped in a state of frantic denial. They had retreated to their lavish room after the incident at the designer boutique, convincing themselves that a systemic banking error had temporarily frozen their accounts. They had ordered overpriced room service and consumed several bottles of vintage champagne, trying to drown their rising anxiety in the familiar comforts of luxury. When the loud knocking echoed through the spacious suite, Derek groaned, sliding out of the high-thread count sheets with a heavy sigh. He threw on a silk robe, muttering about the unacceptable incompetence of the resort staff. He marched across the polished teak floor and yanked the heavy door open, fully prepared to unleash his executive authority on whatever poor employee had dared to disturb his sleep. Instead, he found himself face to face with the senior night manager, flanked silently by 2 large resort security officers dressed in crisp white uniforms. The manager did not offer the polite greeting Derek was accustomed to. His face was a mask of cold detachment. He opened a thick leather folio with a swift, practiced motion. He informed Derek in a tone that lacked any warmth that the resort banking system had performed its routine midnight sweep of all active guest accounts. He stated that the primary credit card placed on file for incidentals had been formally rejected by the issuing bank, with a hard code indicating severe suspected fraud. Furthermore, the manager explained that every subsequent attempt to process alternative payment methods linked to Derek's name had returned the exact same hard decline status. He handed Derek a long, itemized receipt. The total outstanding balance was a staggering $40,000. This massive sum included the daily premium rate for their overwater villa, the private yacht transfer from the airport, the cases of vintage champagne they had consumed, and the expensive spa treatments Monica had eagerly booked for the morning. The manager firmly stated that international hospitality protocol required the immediate full settlement of the outstanding debt. He demanded a valid form of payment then and there. Derek stared at the long string of numbers printed at the bottom of the receipt, his vision blurring as a wave of terror washed over his body. The grand illusion of his massive self made success shattered into pieces. He had spent years cultivating the persona of a brilliant corporate titan, a man who effortlessly commanded respect and endless financial resources. But standing in the doorway of his luxurious suite surrounded by unyielding security guards, he was suddenly reduced to exactly what he truly was. He was a fraud, a deeply incompetent parasite who had been entirely dependent on my generosity and my pristine corporate reputation. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project a hollow confidence. He angrily told the manager that there was obviously a massive mistake with his American banking institution. He loudly declared that he was the chief operating officer of a real estate firm in Texas, and he demanded that the resort immediately reverse the charges and issue a formal apology for the midnight intrusion. The manager simply stared at him, completely unimpressed by the frantic, desperate bluster. He calmly repeated his demand for immediate verifiable payment. Realizing that his arrogant tactics were failing miserably, Derek pulled his smartphone from the pocket of his silk robe. His hands were shaking as he frantically searched for my contact number. He intended to wake me up, yell at me for my banking incompetence, and demand that I wire the funds to release the hold on his accounts. He was fully prepared to use his standard cocktail of guilt and manipulative anger. He pressed the bright green call button and lifted the sleek device to his ear, his jaw clenched tightly as he waited for the familiar ringtone. Instead of the ringing sound, a harsh robotic click echoed through the tiny speaker. A flat, emotionless, automated voice filled his ear, stating repeatedly that the number he had dialed was no longer in service and had been permanently disconnected. I had instructed Thomas to terminate my personal cellular account the moment the eviction was finalized. I had severed the absolute last remaining thread of direct communication. Derek pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the screen in horror. He pressed the call button again, his breathing growing rapid. The exact same robotic voice repeated the devastating message. The realization hit him with physical force. I was permanently gone. The senior night manager watched Derek's rapid psychological collapse with patience. He slowly closed the thick leather folio and stepped slightly closer to the doorway, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He informed Derek that the resort had a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding wire fraud and theft of luxury services. He stated that if a valid functioning credit card was not produced within the next 5 minutes, he would be obligated to contact the local Maldivian police authorities. He calmly explained that the local laws regarding the theft of hospitality services were severe and that their American passports would be confiscated by the authorities upon their arrest. He painted a terrifying picture of the immediate future. They would not be returning to Texas. They would be forcibly removed from their luxurious overwater villa, transported to a crowded local holding cell, and locked away until the massive debt was fully satisfied. The mention of the police and the confiscation of their passports completely drained the last remaining traces of color from Derek's face. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing silently, as his brain desperately tried and failed to formulate a coherent escape plan. Monica woke up disturbed by the tense voices echoing near the entrance of the suite. She groggily walked out of the master bedroom, wearing a thin, expensive designer nightgown, rubbing her tired eyes. She stopped when she saw the large security officers standing in her private hallway. She asked Derek what was happening, her voice shrill and heavily laced with a sudden rising panic. Derek turned to face his wife, his demeanor entirely broken. He looked at the woman he had conspired with, the woman who had happily pushed him to steal my wealth and plot my permanent confinement in a restricted nursing facility. He had nothing left to offer her. The stark terror finally settled deeply into their bones as they looked at each other in the dim light of the hallway. They simultaneously realized the absolute inescapable and terrifying reality of their current situation. They were completely trapped on a tiny, isolated strip of sand stranded halfway across the world. They had absolutely no functioning money. They had no scheduled return flights. And for the very first time in their entitled lives, they had absolutely no wealthy daddy coming to save them from the brutal consequences of their own horrific actions. I would later learn the exact humiliating details of their desperate scramble for survival from the resort management and the private investigators I had hired to monitor their inevitable collapse. The senior night manager had given them exactly 1 hour to produce the $40,000 they owed. If they failed to pay, the local police would be called, and they would be formally charged with severe hospitality fraud. The luxurious dream they had constructed was rapidly transforming into a suffocating nightmare. The oppressive humidity of the tropical night pressed down on them as they frantically ransacked their premium luggage. They were searching desperately for anything of tangible value. Derek was completely stripped of his arrogant executive persona. He was just a terrified criminal trying to avoid a foreign prison cell. Monica was completely hysterical. She was screaming at him, demanding to know how he could have allowed this disaster to happen. She was entirely forgetting her own active role in the massive corporate embezzlement and the incredibly cruel nursing home plot. They were cornered rats. The resort management arranged for a private security escort to transport them by speedboat from their secluded island directly to the crowded capital city. They were not going there to enjoy a romantic excursion. They were being escorted to a discreet, heavily fortified pawn shop that dealt exclusively in high-end luxury goods. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a harsh light on their absolute ruination. The shop owner was a shrewd and calculating man who recognized desperate tourists the moment they walked through his reinforced door. He examined their offerings with complete cold indifference. Derek presented his primary solid gold watch, the very piece he had proudly flashed at the designer boutique just the day before. Monica, sobbing almost uncontrollably, was forced to slide her massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She had demanded that specific ring, constantly bragging about its clarity to all her shallow friends. Now it was her only bargaining chip to buy her literal freedom. The pawnbroker meticulously weighed the gold and inspected the diamonds under a bright light. He knew they had absolutely no leverage. He offered them a tiny fraction of the actual market value. It was barely enough to cover the exorbitant hotel bill and purchase 2 cheap one-way tickets back to the United States. Derek tried to angrily negotiate, his voice cracking as he desperately cited the original retail value. The broker simply slid the expensive items back across the scratched glass counter and flatly told him to try his luck with the local police. Derek swallowed his remaining pride and accepted the terrible offer. They were handed stacks of local currency, completely stripped of their most prized possessions. They were heavily escorted right back to the island resort to finally settle their massive debt. Once the staggering hotel bill was paid, and they were unceremoniously evicted from their premium overwater villa, the fragile veneer of their perfect marriage completely disintegrated. They found themselves standing on the hot concrete of the main airport terminal, dragging their heavy designer suitcases behind them. The oppressive tropical heat caused the sweat to literally pour down their faces, ruining the carefully applied cosmetics of Monica and soaking the expensive linen shirt of Derek. The crushing stress of absolute poverty instantly turned them violently against each other. They began to scream viciously in the middle of the crowded terminal, entirely abandoning any remaining sense of public decorum. Monica shrieked that Derek was a worthless, incompetent fool who had completely ruined her life. She blamed him entirely for the frozen bank accounts, loudly accusing him of mismanaging his corporate funds and failing to secure my vast wealth as he had repeatedly promised. Derek fired back with equal venom, his face turning an angry red. He yelled that her insatiable greed and her incredibly reckless spending habits were the exact reason they were in this terrifying mess. He brutally reminded her that she was the one who had insisted on the incredibly expensive premium suite upgrades and the endless bottles of overpriced vintage champagne. They hurled vile insults and bitter accusations, completely exposing the deeply toxic, highly transactional nature of their entire relationship. They were no longer a glamorous power couple. They were 2 cornered predators furiously fighting over the pathetic scraps of a failed scam. They realized they were bound together not by genuine love or mutual respect, but by a shared, desperate greed that had suddenly evaporated into thin air. The traveling tourists passing by openly stared at them with a potent mixture of pity and absolute disgust as they continued their vicious, deeply humiliating public argument. With the tiny fraction of cash they had left over from the humiliating pawnshop transaction, Derek approached the budget airline ticketing counter. He could not purchase the luxurious first-class accommodations they were so accustomed to. He was forced to buy the absolute cheapest, lowest-tier economy tickets, currently available for a flight back to Texas. The itinerary was a grueling 30-hour ordeal involving 3 separate lengthy layovers in incredibly crowded, chaotic international airports. They dragged their heavy bags toward the extreme back of the crowded airplane, their faces pale and drawn from severe physical exhaustion and mounting emotional stress. They were forcefully squeezed into the cramped, deeply uncomfortable middle seats, entirely surrounded by loudly crying children and heavily snoring passengers. For 30 agonizing hours, they sat in a tense, suffocating silence, physically unable to escape the crushing reality of their new situation. But as the incredibly long flight droned on, their initial panic began to slowly mutate into a dark, simmering, uncontrollable rage. Derek convinced himself that I had simply suffered a massive temporary senile lapse in my personal judgment. He truly believed that I was just a confused, easily manipulated old man who had accidentally tripped a random security protocol at the primary bank. He sat in his cramped economy seat, furiously grinding his teeth, together meticulously plotting his highly aggressive return. He was planning to march directly into my quiet study, forcefully assert his executive authority, and loudly demand that I fix the foolish banking errors immediately. He was completely ready to unleash his intense fury on me, fully intending to quickly finalize the terrifying nursing home plot, the very second the corporate accounts were completely unfrozen. He blindly stared out the small, scratched airplane window, fueled entirely by his blinding, entitled rage. He firmly believed he could just easily go back to his sprawling Dallas mansion, quickly unlock the large wooden front door, and confront the crazy old man who had temporarily ruined his perfect luxury vacation. He had absolutely no idea that the massive mansion was already sold. His expensive luxury sports cars were completely gone, and his entire privileged life had been permanently erased from reality. As the plane finally descended toward the familiar Texas skyline, Derek aggressively gripped the plastic armrests of his tiny seat. He rehearsed his angry speech repeatedly in his head, eager to reassert his dominance over me. He was marching directly into a devastating trap that had already snapped shut, sealing his ultimate and unchangeable fate. I would later receive a comprehensive copy of the neighborhood security footage and the responding officer's official incident report, allowing me to view their agonizing arrival with crystal clarity. The massive commercial airliner touched down on the long Dallas runway shortly before midnight. Derek and Monica dragged themselves through the endless customs line, completely stripped of their usual priority access. They were physically exhausted, severely dehydrated, and reeked of stale airplane cabin air and unwashed sweat. Their bodies were stiff from 30 hours of being compressed into tiny economy seats. Because their corporate accounts were completely frozen, they could not summon their usual private black car service to whisk them away in air-conditioned comfort. Instead, they were forced to wait on the humid concrete curb for a budget rideshare vehicle. A beat-up compact sedan pulled up to collect them. They angrily shoved their heavy luggage into the tiny trunk and squeezed into the cramped back seat. During the long, silent ride toward their exclusive gated community, Derek sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tightly clenched. He was actively fueling his own misplaced rage, silently preparing the vicious, entitled speech he planned to deliver to me first thing in the morning. He truly believed he was returning to his fortress to safely reclaim his stolen crown. The budget sedan turned onto the familiar circular driveway of the stone mansion. The driver rudely popped the trunk and immediately sped away the moment they pulled their bags onto the concrete. The heavy Texas midnight heat wrapped around them like a wet blanket as they exhaustedly wheeled their luggage toward the grand entrance. The magnificent house stood entirely dark and silent against the night sky. Derek marched up the wide stone steps, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. He confidently reached for the sleek digital smart lock that he had installed just a year prior. He expected the sensor to instantly recognize his presence, emit a chime, and automatically unlatch the heavy wooden doors. Instead, his hand met cold, unfamiliar metal. He blinked, shaking his tired head, and leaned closer to the doorframe. The highly expensive biometric keypad was completely gone. In its place sat a heavy basic brass deadbolt freshly installed and entirely unrecognizable. A sudden wave of profound confusion washed over his sweat-drenched face. He frantically dug through his designer leather pockets, searching for the physical emergency backup key he kept on his daily keyring. He violently jammed the small piece of metal into the new brass cylinder and twisted with all his remaining strength. The key refused to turn. The internal pins were completely different. The physical lock had been permanently changed. Monica dragged her suitcase up the final step, dropping it onto the stone porch with a thud. She whined loudly, complaining about the suffocating heat and demanding that Derek open the door immediately so she could finally take a hot shower. Derek ignored her, violently jiggling the brass handle and shoving his thick shoulder heavily against the solid oak. The massive door did not budge a single millimeter. The fortress he thought he commanded was sealed against him. The terrifying reality of his total financial execution had finally followed him all the way home from the Indian Ocean. Blind, unadulterated panic completely overrode his deep physical exhaustion. He lost whatever tiny shred of rational control he had left in his system. He took a full step back, raised his heavy boot, and began to violently kick the bottom of the grand wooden door. The loud, hollow thuds echoed violently through the silent, highly exclusive neighborhood. He began to scream, his voice cracking with absolute desperation, demanding that whoever was hiding inside open the door immediately. He loudly shouted that he was the chief operating officer of the entire estate, desperately clinging to a meaningless title that no longer existed. He kicked the solid wood again and again, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. Suddenly, the massive exterior security floodlights blazed to life, instantly flooding the entire stone porch with blinding, brilliant white light. Derek instinctively shielded his sensitive eyes, breathing heavily, genuinely, believing his aggressive physical tactics had successfully intimidated whoever had dared to lock him out of his own grand home. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked sharply from the inside. The massive oak door swung forcefully inward, but it was not a confused house-sitter or a security guard standing in the grand foyer. It was a very large, deeply irritated man, wearing a dark silk bathrobe. He was tightly gripping a heavy aluminum baseball bat in his right hand. The imposing stranger stared out at the two sweaty, highly disheveled figures standing on his pristine porch, his eyes narrowing with immediate, absolute hostility. Derek froze, his raised fist dropping slowly to his side. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to summon his usual arrogant executive tone, and loudly demanded to know what this strange man was doing inside his private house. The stranger stepped aggressively forward, planting his bare feet firmly on the expensive imported marble floor. He tightened his grip on the aluminum bat and raised his deep voice, the harsh sound cutting right through the thick, humid night air. He told Derek that he was completely out of his mind. He stated with absolute unyielding authority that he had personally purchased this entire property in pure cash just 5 short days ago. He demanded to know exactly who the hell they were and what they were doing, violently kicking his front door at 2 o'clock in the morning. Monica let out a high, deeply hysterical shriek, loudly insisting that it was a massive misunderstanding and that they permanently lived there. The stranger did not hesitate for a single second. He pointed the baseball bat directly at Derek's chest and firmly ordered them to get off his private property immediately before he called the local police to arrest them for an attempted home invasion. Derek tried to argue frantically, stammering about his family trust and his father's banking errors, but his words were completely useless. The deeply angry man pulled a sleek mobile phone from the pocket of his dark robe, brought it directly to his ear, and aggressively dialed the emergency dispatch number right in front of their horrified faces. He loudly provided the dispatcher with his exact residential address and reported 2 hostile, completely unhinged vagrants attempting to break into his newly purchased family home. The absolute finality of the strange man's actions utterly broke Derek's arrogant spirit. He quickly grabbed Monica by her thin arm, completely ignoring her shrill, panicked protests, and physically dragged her down the wide stone steps. They stumbled backward down the long concrete driveway, blindly pulling their cheap luggage behind them, constantly looking nervously over their shoulders at the massive floodlights and the angry armed man actively guarding the front door. They were unceremoniously forced to retreat all the way to the public sidewalk, standing silently under the dim yellow glow of a neighborhood street lamp like 2 discarded pieces of trash. The luxurious, untouchable kingdom they had so arrogantly stolen was permanently lost to them forever. As they stood shivering in the humid night air under the flickering amber glow of the street lamp, the distant wail of approaching sirens sliced through the heavy silence. Within minutes, the dark street was completely illuminated by the harsh red and blue lights of two local police cruisers. The vehicles pulled up sharply to the curb, their heavy tires grinding against the pavement, right in front of where Derek and Monica were huddled with their cheap suitcases. The immediate reality of law enforcement arriving on the scene sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through their exhausted bodies. 4 police officers stepped out of their vehicles simultaneously, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They quickly assessed the bizarre situation, taking in the sight of the disheveled, sweat-stained couple loitering suspiciously outside the grand estate. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, approached them and firmly demanded an immediate explanation for their presence. Derek tried to straighten his wrinkled linen shirt, desperately attempting to project a sense of wealthy authority that he no longer possessed. He launched into a frantic, convoluted story about banking errors, confused family trusts, and a deranged squatter who had illegally occupied his private mansion. He wildly gestured toward the massive stone house, insisting his name was on the property documents and demanding that the officers force the stranger out. The officers listened with cold, professional skepticism. They had already received a clear dispatch call from a highly cooperative, fully documented property owner inside the residence. The lead officer held up his hand sharply, cutting off Derek's frantic rambling. He calmly informed Derek that the gentleman inside possessed a freshly executed property deed and that Derek was currently trespassing. He firmly asked them to produce valid identification and ordered them to remain exactly where they were. Before Derek could formulate another desperate lie, the deep rumble of a heavy engine echoed down the quiet street. A sleek, polished black SUV glided smoothly around the corner and pulled to a graceful stop directly behind the parked cruisers. The tinted rear window lowered slightly, and then the heavy door swung open. I stepped out onto the paved street, feeling the warm night breeze against my face. I was not dressed in the casual retirement clothes I usually wore. I was wearing a perfectly tailored dark charcoal business suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep crimson silk tie. I stood tall, my shoulders squared entirely, projecting the aura of a man who possessed absolute, unyielding control over his empire. The crushing exhaustion and the heavy grief that had plagued me for months were completely gone. I felt rejuvenated, immensely powerful, and easily 10 years younger. The sharp contrast between my pristine composure and their desperate poverty was poetic. I walked deliberately toward the cluster of police officers, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the asphalt. Monica saw me approaching from the shadows, and her fragile mind finally snapped under the immense pressure. Her eyes widened with absolute feral madness. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest and began to scream with a shrill, completely hysterical volume that echoed against the neighboring houses. She shrieked that I was a vicious monster who had ruined her perfect life. She wildly commanded the stunned police officers to arrest me immediately, loudly declaring that I had stolen her beautiful house and illegally frozen her private bank accounts. She lunged forward, her hands curled into desperate claws, losing any remaining semblance of basic human sanity. The lead officer stepped directly into her path, raising his hands in a highly authoritative gesture. He barked a sharp command, sternly warning her to step back and lower her voice instantly, or she would find herself in handcuffs for disorderly conduct. Monica froze, trembling violently, hot tears streaming down her ruined face as the stark reality of the police warning washed over her. She retreated behind Derek, sobbing uncontrollably. I offered the police officers a calm, highly respectful nod, completely ignoring Monica's chaotic breakdown occurring just a few feet away. I introduced myself with quiet authority and calmly explained the precise legal parameters of the situation. I informed the officers that the 2 individuals standing before them were simply evicted former tenants who had severely breached their residential lease agreement due to massive corporate financial crimes. I assured the authorities that the new property owner inside the mansion was a legitimate associate of mine, and that the eviction process had been executed with absolute flawless legality. The officers, instantly recognizing my confident demeanor and my clear, rational explanation, visibly relaxed their defensive postures. They nodded in understanding, realizing that they were not dealing with a chaotic home invasion, but rather the messy fallout of a completely legal corporate termination. I slowly turned my cold, unyielding gaze directly toward Derek. He was staring at me with a pathetic mixture of absolute terror and complete devastating realization. The arrogant predator who had stolen my wealth and plotted to lock me away in a restricted medical ward was completely gone. He was nothing but a frightened, broken shell of a man. I took a deliberate step forward, completely invading his personal space. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder. I held it out toward him, letting it hover in the humid air between us. Derek stared down at the manila folder, his breathing shallow. His hands remained rigidly glued to his sides, as if touching the paper would somehow cause physical pain. I did not break my intense glacial eye contact. I pushed the folder firmly against his wrinkled chest, forcing him to reflexively raise his hands and take possession of his own ultimate destruction. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring that only he and Monica could hear the final truth of their ruination. I told him that inside that specific folder was the formal documentation of his immediate termination from my corporation with extreme prejudice. I explained that it also contained the undeniable proof of his $2 million cryptocurrency embezzlement, alongside the falsified vendor invoices from his pathetic vow renewal party. I watched his eyes widen as the sheer volume of his exposed crimes crashed over his fragile psyche. I softly informed him that the local district attorney had already received identical copies of those documents and that active criminal fraud charges had officially been filed that very morning. I saw the last remaining spark of defiance completely extinguish from his soul. He opened his dry mouth, perhaps attempting to formulate a desperate apology or a pathetic plea for family mercy, but no sound emerged. I cut him off before he could even try. I leaned slightly closer, smelling the sour stench of his fear. I told him I had seen the vile emails regarding the state-run nursing facility. I whispered that he had fundamentally underestimated the man who built his world. I stepped slowly back, adjusting my suit jacket, and calmly told him he was no longer my son. I turned my back on them and walked gracefully toward the waiting black SUV. I stepped into the immaculate leather interior without offering them a single backward glance. The heavy door closed with a solid thud. I quickly instructed my highly professional driver to proceed, but before he could smoothly shift into gear, a loud, violent pounding abruptly echoed against my passenger window. Monica had thrown her entire body against the thick glass. She was screaming frantically, her face contorted in absolute fury, entirely ignoring the verbal warnings from the police officers actively rushing forward to safely restrain her. I looked at her twisted features through the dark tint. I quickly realized that my dramatic departure was slightly premature. The financial executions were completely finished, but the deep emotional reckoning remained entirely unresolved. There was one final debt requiring immediate collection. I signaled my loyal driver to hold our position. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grasped the cold chrome handle, and pushed the heavy door open, forcing Monica to stumble backward onto the paved street. The officers quickly moved to pull Monica away, but I raised my hand calmly, respectfully, requesting a brief moment. The lead officer nodded, maintaining a firm grip on her arm. I adjusted my silk tie and stepped back out under the amber street lamp. Derek was standing a few feet away, completely paralyzed, his white-knuckled hands clutching the thick manila folder I had forced upon him. He looked exactly like a broken man, helplessly witnessing his own pathetic funeral. I walked slowly toward them, my leather shoes clicking sharply in the night air. I stopped directly in front of Monica. She was panting heavily, staring at me with burning hatred and rising terror. I looked her dead in the eye. The silence stretched between us, thick and incredibly heavy. I reminded her of the lavish vow renewal party she eagerly hosted, and the large crowd she enthusiastically gathered to witness my engineered humiliation. I kept my voice perfectly level, calmly projecting my absolute control. I spoke clearly, ensuring everyone could hear my words. I told her that she had slapped me exactly 10 times across the face for a crude, disrespectful joke. I told her that every single strike was a calculated insult designed to strip away my dignity in front of her friends. I told her that I did not respond with vulgar outbursts, but with meticulous precision. I reached over to Derek and pulled the thick manila folder from his trembling hands. I opened the flap and looked directly into Monica's eyes. I told her that she slapped me 10 times for a joke, so I had brought her 10 pieces of paper in return. I pulled the first document from the stack and held it up. I announced that the first piece of paper was the official notice of the house sale. I explained that the beautiful Dallas mansion she loved to flaunt was gone sold entirely for cash to a corporate developer. I pulled the second document. I announced that it was the formal termination of Derek's employment, effective immediately, permanently, severing his access to my corporate empire. I pulled the third document, letting it flutter slightly in the warm breeze. I stated that this was the formal civil lawsuit demanding the immediate repayment of the $2 million they had systematically embezzled through fraudulent cryptocurrency investments. I pulled the fourth piece of paper, confirming the legal repossession orders for their customized luxury vehicles, leaving them completely without transportation. I pulled the fifth document showcasing the absolute permanent cancellation of every single corporate and personal credit line they possessed. I explained that their infinite spending power was permanently revoked, leaving them entirely destitute. I pulled the sixth document from the heavy folder. I declared that it was the finalized legal decree of my last will and testament, outlining their complete and total disinheritance. I stated that they would never receive a single penny of my accumulated wealth upon my passing. I pulled out a small, cheap brass key securely taped to the seventh piece of paper. I tossed it onto the concrete directly at Monica's feet. I explained that it was the key to a filthy storage unit on the industrial outskirts of the city, where her priceless designer handbags were currently baking in the oppressive Texas heat. I pulled the eighth document, a simple printed email thread. I held it up so Derek could see the text. I explained that this was the correspondence between Monica and a restrictive state-run nursing facility. I stated that it clearly outlined her vicious plot to have me falsely declared mentally incompetent and locked away so she could freely raid my corporate accounts. I pulled the ninth document, a court-ordered mandate. I announced that it was a strict restraining order, specifically filed against Monica, legally barring her from coming within 500 feet of myself, my residence, or any of my corporate properties. I finally pulled the 10th piece of paper from the empty folder. I handed it directly to Derek. I calmly explained that it was the fully itemized bill for their lavish vow renewal party. I stated that the $150,000 expense had been legally transferred directly to their personal debt. I told them that the 10 slaps were now officially returned in full. The devastating impact of the 10 documents settled over them like a physical weight. Derek stared at the final bill in his hand, his eyes completely unfocused. But it was the mention of the 8th document that finally broke his frozen state. He lunged forward and snatched the printed email regarding the nursing home directly from my hand. His eyes darted rapidly across the page, reading the undeniable proof of Monica's independent plotting. He realized that she had recklessly put her malicious intentions into writing. The fragile united front they had maintained instantly shattered into a million sharp pieces. Derek turned on Monica with a sudden explosive ferocity. He screamed at her, his voice echoing loudly down the street, calling her a reckless, greedy fool. He viciously blamed her entirely for their total ruin, shrieking that her insatiable need for luxury and her incredibly stupid nursing home plot had destroyed his career and his life. Monica shrieked right back, her face twisting in ugly, desperate anger, loudly claiming that he was a weak, pathetic man who could not even defend his own wife. Their beautiful, perfect marriage completely dissolved into a toxic screaming match right on the public sidewalk. Derek suddenly stopped yelling. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his absolute poverty and his impending criminal prosecution finally crushed the last ounce of defiance from his spirit. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the hard paved concrete landing squarely on his knees. He looked up at me, hot tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking into pathetic, ragged sobs. He begged me for mercy. He pleaded for a second chance, promising to pay back every single dollar, begging his father to save him from the nightmare he had created. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no anger, and no sorrow. I felt only pure, clean closure. I turned around, stepped back into the quiet sanctuary of my vehicle, and told my driver to take me home. Before my driver could shift the SUV into drive, a sudden weight latched onto my right leg. I looked down. Derek had practically crawled across the rough concrete sidewalk. His expensive linen trousers were torn at the knees, heavily stained with dirt and his own sweat. His hands, shaking violently, were gripping the tailored fabric of my suit pants. He was weeping with a loud guttural intensity that sounded entirely primal. It was the sound of a man who was watching his entire universe collapse into dust. He yanked at my pant leg, his face tilted toward the amber street lamp, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He began to desperately throw the woman he had just renewed his vows with under the bus. He shrieked that everything was Monica's fault. He sobbed that she was a wicked, manipulative woman who had systematically poisoned his mind against me. He cried that she was the one who demanded more money, more luxury, and more power. He swore on his life that the $2 million cryptocurrency embezzlement was entirely her idea. A malicious scheme she had concocted with her greedy friends to fund a lifestyle he could never afford on his own. He pointed a trembling finger at his wife, loudly declaring to the police officers and to me that the nursing home plot was her ultimate betrayal, and that he had been too weak and too blinded by his marriage to stop her evil machinations. Monica stood a few feet away, temporarily stunned into absolute silence by the sheer magnitude of his cowardice. Her mouth hung open as she listened to the man she loved publicly dismantle her character to save his own skin. The remaining fragments of their lavish, carefully curated partnership completely disintegrated into a toxic puddle on the Dallas pavement. She suddenly let out a deafening, piercing scream, lunging toward Derek with her hands outstretched, ready to physically attack him for his treason. The two police officers instantly moved in, grabbing Monica by the shoulders and forcefully pulling her back. They issued stern, loud commands, warning her that she was inches away from being placed in the back of a squad car for assault. Derek completely ignored her frantic screaming. He kept his tear-soaked face turned upward toward me, his grip on my leg tightening even further. He begged for a second chance. He pleaded for his father to forgive his weakness. He promised to divorce Monica immediately, promising to testify against her in a court of law if I would just drop the crushing civil lawsuit and restore his corporate access. He swore he would start over from the absolute bottom, working in the mailroom if he had to, just to prove his renewed loyalty. Looking down at his tear-streaked face, I felt a sudden, unexpected pang of deep fatherly grief strike my chest. For a brief, fleeting second, the ruined man groveling on the sidewalk vanished, and I saw the young boy he used to be. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in our old driveway. I remembered the fierce pride I felt when he graduated from college, fully believing he would honorably inherit the corporate empire I had sacrificed my youth to build. It was a phantom pain, a heavy, sorrowful mourning for a son who was essentially dead to me. But that brief flicker of paternal instinct was instantly, completely suffocated by the cold, undeniable reality of his actions. I looked at the thick manila folder resting on the concrete beside his knees. I vividly remembered the missing $2 million that represented the hard work of hundreds of my dedicated employees. I vividly remembered the vile, calculated emails detailing exactly how he planned to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me in a clinical cage so he could effortlessly steal my fortune. He was not a misled victim of a manipulative spouse. He was a willing, active participant in his own greed. I reached down and firmly grasped his wrists. I did not act with sudden anger or chaotic violence. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I forcefully peeled his shaking fingers off my suit, prying his hands away from my leg. He resisted for a fraction of a second, before his strength completely failed him. He slumped forward, his hands pressing flat against the warm Texas concrete, his shoulders heaving with uncontrolled sobs. I stood tall, looking down at the absolute ruin of a man who thought he could outsmart his own father. I kept my voice incredibly calm, devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any lingering affection. I told him that a man is ultimately defined by the consequences of his own choices. I told him that he had eagerly chased the glittering illusion of endless wealth, and he had willingly sacrificed his integrity, his family, and his honor to secure it. I looked at his bowed head and delivered my final unyielding judgment. I told him that he had meticulously made his bed, and now he was going to sleep in it. I turned away from him for the absolute last time. I stepped smoothly up into the spacious, air-conditioned cabin of the black luxury SUV and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The solid thud of the closing door was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I settled into the plush leather seat and pressed a silver button on the door panel. The thick, heavily tinted window began to silently glide upward. As the glass rose, the chaotic sounds of the street began to fade. I could see Derek still kneeling on the pavement, crying out my name, his face contorted in utter despair. I could see Monica struggling furiously against the firm grip of the local police officers, her mouth wide open in an endless hysterical scream. I could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the stone facade of the magnificent mansion they had foolishly believed was theirs to conquer. The thick glass completely sealed shut, with a soft click instantly muting their desperate shrieks into a dull, distant hum. The total silence inside the vehicle was incredibly pure, heavy, and deeply comforting. I looked at my professional driver through the rearview mirror. I gave him a simple, subtle nod. He smoothly shifted the heavy vehicle into gear, and we slowly pulled away from the curb. We drove past the police cruisers and turned the corner, leaving the emergency lights behind us. I sat quietly in the back seat as the SUV glided through the dark streets of the Dallas suburbs. I did not look back. I felt an incredible weight lift from my shoulders, a heavy burden of toxic obligation that I had carried for far too long. The meticulous precision of my retaliation had been exhausting, but the profound sense of absolute closure was worth every calculated step. The vast corporate empire I had built was perfectly secure, completely purged of the parasitic entitlement that had threatened to destroy it from the inside out. My finances were fortified, my legal protections were impenetrable, and my physical sanctuary was my own once again. 6 months have passed since that humid Texas night when the illusion of my son completely shattered upon the hard concrete. The fallout from my meticulously executed financial blockade was swift and merciless. The district attorney did not offer Derek any lenient plea deals. The mountain of forensic evidence I handed over was entirely irrefutable. Confronted with undeniable proof of his $2 million embezzlement, Derek was forced to plead guilty to severe corporate fraud. He avoided a federal penitentiary only because the judge mandated a strict program of total financial restitution. My former company secured a permanent civil judgment against him. His entire life became defined by an unpayable debt. The lavish lifestyle he arrogantly enjoyed was stripped away, replaced by the grim reality of extreme poverty. Derek currently works the graveyard shift at an unheated industrial distribution warehouse located on the bleak outer edge of the city. He is no longer a wealthy executive barking orders from a luxurious corner office. He is a disgraced laborer who spends 10 grueling hours a night loading cardboard boxes onto wooden pallets. His tailored designer suits have been permanently replaced by a cheap reflective vest and scuffed steel-toed boots. Every Friday, the state automatically garnishes 80% of his minimum wage paycheck, routing the sum directly back to my corporate accounts to satisfy his restitution. He lives in a dilapidated studio apartment, driving a rusty sedan that barely manages to start. He is physically exhausted, entirely broken, and permanently trapped in a dismal cycle of physical labor that will likely outlast his natural lifespan. The golden future I prepared for him was burned to ash by his greed. When the stolen money officially ran out and the facade crumbled, the depth of Monica and Derek's toxic marriage was instantly exposed. Monica did not stand by her husband during his publicized legal downfall. The very second she realized the bank accounts were permanently closed and the diamond rings had been pawned away in the Maldives, she filed for an immediate divorce. She attempted to drag Derek through the family court system, selfishly demanding exorbitant spousal support. However, the judge took one look at the massive criminal judgments leveled against Derek and swiftly dismissed her absurd financial demands. She walked away from the ruined marriage with nothing but a cheap plastic suitcase and a humiliated ego. She was forced to move back into the cramped spare bedroom of her aging parents' suburban home. She currently spends her days scrolling through social media, bitterly watching her former friends enjoy the lavish parties and exclusive tropical vacations she can no longer afford to attend, while my former family members slowly suffocated beneath the consequences of their terrible choices, experienced a profound rebirth. The swift, highly profitable sale of their stone mansion had flooded my accounts with millions of dollars in liquid capital. I did not reinvest that sum into another cold corporate acquisition or empty luxury property. Instead, I carefully channeled the fortune into a cause that held deep personal meaning. I stand today on the corner of a revitalized downtown avenue, looking up at the pristine brick facade of a beautifully restored building. The grand silver letters mounted above the wide glass entrance glisten brightly in the warm morning sun. They read Sarah Campbell Senior Shelter. Sarah was my late sister, a wonderfully kind woman who had spent her final incredibly vulnerable years suffering in a horribly mismanaged, underfunded state nursing facility, because we simply did not have the money to save her back then. The terrifying email plot Derek and Monica orchestrated to lock me away forcefully resurrected her painful memory. I had successfully transformed that dark, horrifying threat into a vibrant beacon of hope for others. The facility standing before me is a state-of-the-art funded sanctuary designed exclusively to protect, house, and beautifully support abandoned elderly citizens who have been cruelly discarded by their own greedy families. We provide them with premium medical care, warm meals, and a deeply respectful community where they can safely enjoy their twilight years without the constant, terrifying fear of financial exploitation. I walk through the bright, sunlit hallways of the shelter, listening to the gentle laughter of the residents and the soft, comforting hum of the dedicated nursing staff. The space is completely alive with genuine warmth and absolute safety. I personally funded the entire operation, guaranteeing that no vulnerable senior citizen within these walls will ever experience the terrible, suffocating dread that my own son had so viciously tried to inflict upon me. Every single dollar that Derek and Monica had intended to steal for their vanity was now actively serving a higher, undeniably noble purpose. I slowly walk out onto the spacious outdoor patio, holding a steaming cup of dark black coffee in my right hand. The morning air is crisp, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of blooming gardenias. I take a slow, deep sip of the bitter brew, feeling the heat radiate through my chest. I look out over the peaceful courtyard, reflecting on the long, grueling journey that brought me to this exact moment in time. For decades, I had falsely equated my success as a father with my ability to endlessly provide material wealth. I had blindly poured my sweat, my endless hours, and my absolute dedication into securing a flawless financial future for my son, foolishly believing that my constant generosity would automatically generate his eternal loyalty and his deep respect. I had fundamentally misunderstood the dangerous, corrupting nature of unearned privilege. By constantly shielding him from consequence and showering him with unearned luxury, I had inadvertently created a vicious, entitled parasite who viewed my simple existence as an incredibly frustrating obstacle to his ultimate inheritance. The violent shattering of that dangerous illusion had been the most painful experience of my entire life, but it was also the most profoundly liberating. Taking down my own son required a level of calculated ruthlessness I never knew I possessed, but it was absolutely necessary for my own basic survival. As I stand here today, entirely free from the toxic, suffocating grip of their endless manipulation, I finally understand the true, undeniable definition of actual power. True power is not the ability to endlessly provide for the people around you. It is not the massive accumulation of corporate assets or the ability to command a boardroom. True power is the absolute unyielding ability to look directly into the eyes of a deeply entitled parasite, even if they share your own blood, and finally say the word no. It is the profound courage to forcefully protect your own dignity, to aggressively guard your hard-earned peace, and to ruthlessly cut away the diseased branches of your life so that the remaining roots can finally thrive. I take another sip of my coffee, feeling the warm sun on my face. The battle is completely over. The incredible victory is entirely mine, and my brand new life has only just beautifully begun. I will never look backward, gracefully embracing this incredibly wonderful, hard-earned chapter of my existence. With an open, completely unburdened, and deeply joyful, entirely satisfied human heart today, life teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. Unconditionally providing for someone does not guarantee their loyalty. Quite often, it only breeds catastrophic entitlement. We sacrifice our sweat and our prime years deeply, believing we are securing our family future, only to become the very targets of their unchecked greed. You must never allow your love as a parent or a partner to blind you to the harsh reality of financial and emotional abuse. Your personal dignity has no price tag, and your respect is not a commodity to be traded. Protect your assets, trust your instincts, remove toxic people. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people you sacrificed everything to help? How did you take your power back? Drop your story in the comments below. If my ultimate revenge completely satisfied you, please smash that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable stories. Stay strong and vigilant.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.